Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 27, Text 14, Translation and Commentary by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Bhuta Sukshma Indriya Manaha Buddhi Adishu Iha Nidraya Lineshu Asati Yaha Tatra Vinidraha Nirahankriyaha Bhuta Sukshmendriyamano Buddhyadishviha Nidraya Lineshvasati Yastatra Vinidro Nirahankriyaha Bhuta Sukshmendriyamano Buddhyadishviha Nidraya Lineshvasati Yastatra Vinidro Nirahankriyaha. Bhuta, the material elements. Sukshma, the objects of enjoyment. Indriya, the material senses. Manaha, mind. Buddhi, intelligence. Adishu, and so on. Iha, here. H-E-R-E. Nidraya, by sleep. Lineshu, merged. Asati, in the unmanifest. Yaha, who. Tatra, there. Vinidraha, awake. Nirahankriyaha, freed from false ego. Although a devotee appears to be merged in the five material elements, the objects of material enjoyment, the material senses, and material mind and intelligence, he is understood to be awake and to be freed from the false ego. Purport. The explanation by Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of how a person can be liberated even in this body is more elaborately explained in this verse. The living entity who has become Satyadrik, who realizes his position in relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, may remain apparently merged in the five elements of matter, the five material sense objects, the 10 senses, and the mind and intelligence. But still he is considered to be awake and to be freed from the reaction of false ego. Here the word lina is very significant. The Mayavadi philosophers recommend merging in the impersonal effulgence of Brahman, that is their ultimate goal or destination. That merging is also mentioned here. But in spite of merging, one can keep his individuality. The example given by Jiva Goswami is that a green bird that enters a green tree appears to merge in the color of greenness, but actually the bird does not lose its individuality. Similarly, a living entity merged either in the material nature or in the spiritual nature does not give up his individuality. real individuality is to understand oneself to be the eternal servitor of the Supreme Lord. This information is received from the mouth of Lord Chaitanya. He said clearly, upon the inquiry of Sanatana Goswami, that a living entity is this servitor of Krishna eternally. That clause is italicized, so I verbally emphasized it. Krishna also confirms in Bhagavad Gita that the living entity is eternally his part and parcel. The part and parcel is meant to serve the whole. This is individuality. It is so even in this material existence, when the living entity apparently merges in matter. His gross body is made up of 5 elements. His subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, false ego and contaminated consciousness. And he has 5 active senses and 5 knowledge-acquiring senses. In this way he merges in matter. But even while merged in the 24 elements of matter, he can keep his individuality as the eternal servitor of the Lord. Either in the spiritual nature or in the material nature, such a servitor is to be considered a liberated soul. That is the explanation of the authorities, and it is confirmed in this verse. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Shreshtam Manumapi Shachi Putram Atra Swarupam Rupam Tasyagrajam Urupurim Maturim Goshtavartim Radha Kundam Girivaramaho Radhika Madhavasham Prapto Yasya Pratita Kripaya Shri Gurum Tam Natosmi Vandeham Shri Guru Shriyatah Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavanscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagarna Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagarna Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari. Srila Prabhupada begins the purport by stating that the explanation by Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of how a person can be liberated even in this body is more elaborately explained in this verse. What is the verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu? Which refers to a person who's liberated even in this body. Iha yasya harer dasye karmana manasa gira nikhilasvapyavastasu jivan mukta sa uchate. Thank you. Jivan mukta means living liberated. Often we think that when someone leaves the body they may be liberated, because as long as they're in the material world we're subject to the conditions of it. This verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu says that even someone in this world right here and now who is engaged in the service of Hari, Krishna, with activities, karmana, manasa, with mind, and gira, with words, and is completely absorbed in that. It doesn't do anything else. Such a person is said to be liberated even in this life. In the next sentence of the purport to the verse we're reading, Srila Prabhupada writes, the living entity who has become Satyadrik, who realizes his position in relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, may remain apparently merged in the 5 elements of matter, the 5 material sense objects, the 10 senses, and the mind and intelligence, but still he is considered to be awake and to be freed from the reaction of false ego. Satyadrik. This refers to the last word of the previous verse, which Srila Prabhupada translates Satyadrik as the self-realized soul, which literally means one who sees the truth or sees properly. Seeing properly means to see one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as Srila Prabhupada emphasizes in this purport. A living entity is the servitor of Krishna eternally. One who realizes that is liberated even in this life. Now we may say, well, it doesn't appear to be liberated from the material conditions. The material energy appears to be acting on such a person and is encaged in a material body which experiences heat and cold and light and darkness, and the mind is also there, which experiences honor and dishonor, happiness and distress, and so on. But the consciousness of a liberated soul is completely different to that of a materialist who's simply interested in enjoying this world. Ya nisha sarva bhutanam yasyam jagarati sangyami. Yasyam jagrati bhutani sa nisha pashyato mune. Hey, Lord Krishna states in the Bhagavad Gita that someone who's liberated or who's awake may appear to be like a materialist. It looks the same. You can't tell just by seeing the body. Well, some people might be able to. Someone who's spiritually awake or who has some mystic potency, just by looking at a person can tell so much about them. Mystic potency also if he's studied physiognomy. Just like we see when Shukdev Goswami came into the assembly of sages, where Parikshit Maharaj was sitting, waiting for his death, then everyone immediately understood by seeing him that he's a highly elevated spiritual personality, even though they themselves were highly elevated spiritual personalities, many of them who are present there. Similarly, when Nimai, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, was born, Sita Devi, the wife of Advaita Acharya, on seeing the child could understand this is Krishna, just a different body, that's all. And all these symptoms, they're mentioned, the 32 symptoms of a liberated person, or an elevated personality. They're quoted in relation to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, taken from the Samudrika of Garuda Purana and quoted in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. But otherwise, to people who are unaware of such subtle science, a liberated person, they may not know. They may not know. It may look to them the same. As Srila Prabhupada often said, to be liberated doesn't mean that you get 10 arms and 5 heads. He gave examples like this, that some spectacular bodily difference is not seen, but it's a question of consciousness. If the consciousness is merged in matter, then one is bound by matter. If the consciousness is absorbed in spirit, then one is free from material bondage. And it's a different outlook, seeing everything differently. Srila Prabhupada gave the example in the previous verses purport that someone sees a beautiful flower and thinks, oh, that's very nice. I can smell it. It will be nice. And someone else thinks, I can offer that to Krishna. He will enjoy it. It's a different outlook on life. Therefore, yanisha sarva bhutanam yasyam jagarti sangyami. The materialists are awake to sense gratification. They're always looking for opportunities for sense gratification. But the devotees are figuratively asleep. They don't see the world as a place for sense gratification. So their senses are not awake to the possibility of sense gratification. But the devotees' senses are awake to opportunities for serving Krishna, whereas the materialists' senses are sleeping in that regard. They don't have any such consciousness whatsoever. So outwardly, a materialist or a spiritualist and a materialist may appear to be the same. But it's a question of consciousness. One who knows that I am not this body, deho smriti nahija shangsha bandhan kaha ta. For one who knows that he's not the body, who doesn't relate to himself as the body, then where's the question of material bondage for such a person? It's an easy principle to understand. Understanding that we are not the body and we have nothing intrinsically to do with this body or anything else in this material world. And if we cultivate that consciousness, then we don't identify with the body and we're liberated from material existence because we don't actually have any real relationship with it whatsoever. Asango hyayang purusha. We are living beings, spiritual by nature, and we don't have any intrinsic relationship with material nature, but desiring to enjoy separately from Krishna, we are given the consciousness which makes it possible to do so. The consciousness of identifying with matter, and then we get bound up in matter. Karya karana kartritve hetu prakritir uchyate purusha sukha dukhanam hetu bhoktritve hetu uchyate. The activities in this world are going on in which someone thinks, I am the doer, I am doing this work, but it's all manifest by material nature. But the suffering and enjoyment depends, suffering and enjoyment in this material world depends on one's identifying with it. If one thinks, I am the enjoyer of this material nature, then he has to suffer and enjoy within material nature. The word enjoy is used in a certain sense, because elsewhere in Gita, Krishna also says, or twice he says in Bhagavad Gita, that this material world is a place of suffering. So when we talk about material enjoyment, we're talking about what is known as enjoyment. It's said to be enjoyment, but it's not actually enjoyment. It's what we think should be enjoyable, but which does not actually bring enjoyment. So the sense of happiness and distress comes from identifying with material nature. And one who doesn't identify with it is automatically liberated, although in one sense you could say he's bound by the body and bound by the conditions. It's not that if one is liberated he can automatically fly in the sky. Actually, the yoga siddhis, they may be given by the Lord to his liberated devotee. He may or may not give them. A liberated devotee may have siddhis or mystic abilities. Mystic ability means, we call it mystic because we think it's something very special. Just like a yogi can fly in the sky, then a bird can fly in the sky also. So there's nothing, we don't think it's very mystic that a bird can fly in the sky. He has the body for that. So we say it's mystic if someone can fly in the sky without a bird's body or similar body. But devotees, they're not interested in these things. If they could help us to serve Krishna, we could use them. But they're generally seen as an obstacle to spiritual advancement. Mystic abilities. They're actually a seduction of Maya. That Maya gives the yogi all these abilities, and he starts, it's just like a kid getting some toys. And he starts to play with them. And all the things, he can fly in the sky, he can make himself invisible, he can bring a pomegranate, sitting in Calcutta, he can bring a pomegranate off the tree and from Afghanistan, that Srila Prabhupada explained in his childhood. One yogi came to his father's house and the yogi asked his father, "So what do you want?" He said, as if to say, I can get it for you. So he said, well, some pomegranates from Kabul, Kabuli. What do you say that in Bengali? Dalim. So then the yogi said, go in the next room, and they were freshly plucked on the branch, some pomegranate, ripe pomegranates. So yogis can do things like that. But so what? There's a well-known story. Well, I don't know how well-known it is, but one young man left home from his village. His village was on the side of a broad river before the days when there were bridges over most of the rivers. He left home, and after 20 years he came back with a long beard and long matted hair, and he told everyone he'd been studying as a yogi in the Himalayas. So one old man said, "So, what did you gain?" He said, "Well, I can walk over the river." Okay, walk over. So he walked over and walked back again. And said, "Very good. You spent 20 years. That's worth 20 paisa." That would be what, 20 pfennig before you had 20 cents. You know what he means? In other words, it's a very insignificant achievement. So I can pay the boatman 20 cents to cross the river. Same result. You get the same result. So what is the value? Such a person is not liberated, but he thinks it's very something very special. And people think it's very special. Oh, he can cross the river by walking. Yeah, or I can cross the river by paying the boatman 20 cents. These mystic achievements. They are highly rated by foolish people, and they are obstacles on the path of actual spiritual realization. The material nature gives that opportunity to do such things, to waylay yogis who are aspiring for actual spiritual realization. But even if they do get to the level of spiritual realization, well, actual spiritual realization means They should recognize Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But the very process makes it unlikely that they will do so, because they're trying in the wrong way. You can chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. You do chant. This chanting is worth more than millions of years sitting in a cave in the Himalayas. In terms of spiritual advancement, it's worth more because it's not the proper process for achieving the highest spiritual goal. You're trying in the wrong way. Some spiritual advancement, maybe in terms of being detached from material nature, from material sensual enjoyment. In this verse we see niraham freed from false ego. But it's very hard. By performing austerities and becoming a great yogi, it's hard to get free from egoism. And in fact, we see often the yogis, they're very egoistic. Just like at Kumbh Mela. If you go to Kumbh Mela, you can see sometimes the yogis, they unwrap their jata. You know, the jata means matted hair. And who's got the longest, he's the most prestigious. That means he's been a yogi longer. And so you see someone who comes all the way down to their ankles and longer. It means he must be a few hundred years old. So people, very great. Yeah. And then you see them lying on a bed of thorns. Stereotypical Indian yogi. Why does he want to come all the way from the mountains to Prayag, walking along? Or if he has yogic potency, he can just jump in the Ganga at the source and pop up the next second, wherever he wants along the Ganga. But why does he come all the way there just to lie on a bed of thorns in public, just to show off, I'm lying on a bed of thorns? You got that satisfaction. What is that? That's just childish, showing off, I'm better than you. I can do it, you can't do it. Childish. There's no actual happiness there. Actual liberation means to always be engaged in the service of Krishna, even in this life. And although such a person may seem to be beset by material miseries, you may get a cold, have a headache, feel disappointed or elated, such a person is liberated. Now that might seem to go against some of the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna says, Na prahrishyat priya prapyang nodvijet prapya apriyaha, that someone is considered transcendently situated when he doesn't become elated when he gets something that others would consider desirable, and he doesn't become disturbed. Nodvijet cha praya prapya. He doesn't become disturbed when something goes wrong, because he's detached from all these things. But a devotee, he becomes happy in certain circumstances and unhappy in other circumstances. So it might seem that a devotee is not liberated. But a devotee's happiness and distress is transcendental because it's in relation to the service of Krishna. We see that Srila Prabhupada was very happy, he was very blissful, elated at the opening of the Krishna Balaram temple in Vrindavan. And prior to that, he had been lividly angry at his disciples for not getting ready in time. You might think, well, that's not very transcendental. Nothing's ready. Oh, okay. Hari Bol. Prabhupada wasn't like that. He was very, very heavy. It was hard for his disciples to take the pressure that he gave because he wanted to please Krishna. And in this way, he was liberated from material considerations because he was not thinking in terms of what I want for myself, but he was thinking what we have to do to bring Krishna consciousness to others. So building that Krishna Balaram temple was very important in that regard. An important word, all the words are important. One word here which Srila Prabhupada states is important. He states in the purport, here the word lean is very significant. That's a commonly used word for impersonalists. Sometimes they're advertised as Brahmaleen. Means he made it. He's merged in Brahman. Leena means merging. Sometimes you'll see posters advertising, and among the many titles they're given, one will be Brahmaleen, one who's merged in the spiritual, in transcendence. But Srila Prabhupada explains it, in spite of merging, one can keep his individuality. That doesn't sound right, does it? You merge and you remain individual at the same time. How is that possible? Well, the example is given. If a green bird enters a green tree. Do you have green birds here? Any green birds? Don't have. Parrots. There are green parrots, very common in India. I saw some flying around in London. I was told that now there are a lot of green parrots in London now. In Leicester also? All over? In Köln. Is that how you say it in German? In Cologne. They're invading. Parrots invasion. So green birds, when they merge, they have a red beak. Do they? They're all different kinds of parrots. So if you look, if they merge into the green forest, if they're flying in the sky, I don't know if you have enough here, but in India you see there may be thousands flying together. You won't get that here, not yet. So many, but then they all go in the trees, and from a distance you can't see the parrots anymore, unless you have a telescope and you can look for the red beak, which stands out. It's a very, very sharp difference between the red and the green. But you can't see them anymore. It seems that they have merged into the green forest. So you could say they've merged. That's according to our vision, they have merged. But actually they retain their individuality. So in one sense they've merged. According to what we see, because we can't see them anymore, the parrot has merged. But actually, he's retained his individuality. So in the same way, merging in transcendence, the idea that we shall merge into the light of impersonal Brahman. But still, despite that apparent merging, individuality is retained. And therefore it's possible to fall from that condition, as is stated in Srimad Bhagavatam. Yeñe ravindaksha vimuktamanenastvayasta bhavad avishuddha buddhaha aruhya kritrena parang padang tata patantyadhanadita yushmadangraya. There are persons who think that they are liberated because with great difficulty, performing very difficult austerities, maybe over many lifetimes, they ascend to the spiritual atmosphere and they merge into some oneness. How do they do that? Because their consciousness becomes purified. It means they're not trying to enjoy this matter. They don't identify with matter. But it's not fully purified if they neglect to worship Krishna, and therefore they fall down again. So they're merging. It's not complete merging. It's not possible that the individual loses his individuality. It may appear like that. It may appear that there are no individual parrots, but there are. So in the same way, that they can fall down again means that they remain individual. So it's only it's only figurative to say that one merges into the impersonal Brahman. Merged in transcendence means that, as stated here in this verse, one's consciousness is completely merged in thoughts of the transcendence, which specifically means Krishna. And it's a very practical process, because to try to merge the consciousness in something indescribable with no characteristics, it's very hard to do that because we can't even imagine it. Let's think of nothing. You can't do it because thinking means there has to be some object of thought, just like seeing means you see something. You say, well, I look at the sky on a clear day, and what do you see? What do you see? You start to see little black things in your eyes, don't you? Little remnants of cells or something. And then you can start to imagine things in the sky if you're looking. This whole idea of emptying the mind and stopping the activities of the mind, that is the stated goal of yoga. Chitta vritti nirodha is the stated goal of yoga, according to Patanjali. Stopping the consciousness, or blocking it. But is that possible? Is it possible to think of nothing and just stop the consciousness? It's not possible. So the proper meaning of Chitta vritti nirodha means to stop thinking of this material world in terms of enjoying it. And then Ishvara pranidhana, worshipping Krishna. That's the actual goal of the Patanjali yoga process. But it's misunderstood and misrepresented. And therefore, in general, people, when they think of spirituality, especially Eastern or Indian spirituality or yoga, spiritual yoga, they think in terms of some impersonal merging into what? Into nothing or some light. But the Krishna consciousness movement teaches something very different. Yoga indriya samyamya. Yoga also means to control the senses. That is there, but the method of controlling the senses begins with the proper understanding that the senses should be engaged in the master of the senses. Eha yasya harer dasya karmana manasagira nikilasya pyavastasu jivan muktasa uchyate. Well, if one understands that the senses are meant to be engaged in the master of the senses, then one is liberated in this life. Hrishikena hrishikesha sevanang bhakti ruchyate. That is called devotion to Krishna, to engage the senses in the service of the master of the senses. And it's all very practical and very easy to understand, and you don't have to do complex yoga practice, just like we see so many. They can't even sit cross-legged for more than 10 minutes. Sit properly! And have to sit with their, holding their knees, they just, because, so painful. And where's the question? I'm meditating. Oh, my knees are hurting. You just can't do it. And then well, in some Buddhist schools, they have the meditation classes, and then if you don't sit straight, if you start to lag, then whew, get thwacked on the back with bamboo, and that wakes you up pretty quick. We didn't institute that in our Krishna conscious movement yet. It's a pretty tough process, but our process is much nicer. We have the flower spray, right? We use that sometimes for waking them up. I learned from Brahmananda. Maybe, did you ever see Brahmananda? The famous Brahmananda. Did you ever see him? On the photo you saw him maybe. One of Srila Prabhupada's first and dearest disciples. He said that I found out the best way to stay awake in class. You give it. If you give the class, it's the best. Although sometimes, I've seen devotees fall asleep also, giving class. Actually, Srila Prabhupada said once that the atheists say that the Srimad Bhagavatam is the best way for insomnia, to cure insomnia. It's a soporific. That means you listen to Bhagavatam, you fall asleep. All of our devotees get plenty of sleep, right? 6 hours at night, 2 hours in the japa period, 1 hour in Bhagavatam class. But we should stay awake and chant. Chanting is easy, right? It's hard to fall asleep. Although there used to be, because the devotees, they were really enthusiastic and they didn't want to sleep any more than 6 hours because they didn't want to be in the mode of ignorance. And it's hard to not sleep more than 6 hours when you have lots of prasadam. So sometimes devotees, they jump in the air and just before they come down, they almost fall asleep. Then they wake up. Actually, it was going on like that. Those are enthusiastic days. But this is yoga. This is the best meditation. Sometimes people find it very difficult to understand. I was in Thailand for some time. And Thailand is a Buddhist country. Theravada Buddhist, in which it's hardcore Buddhism. In which, what does the Buddha do? You see the pictures of course they have laughing Buddha, but that's from China. The original Buddha, you see him in pictures of, he's meditating. Like this. So they find it very hard to relate to when we say this is Bhakti Yoga meditation and devotees are jumping up and down and playing the mridanga. But that is the highest yoga. Yoginam api sarvesham madgatein antaratmana shraddhavan bhajate yomam sameyukta tamo mataha. Krishna says it's the best yoga to be absorbed in Krishna with faith, taking Krishna into one's heart and worshipping Him. And the best way to worship Him in this Kali Yuga, what does it say? Bhagavatam, 11th canto, the Yagya for Kali Yuga. Yagya Sankirtana Prayer Yajanti Hu Sumedasaha. We worship Krishna by the Sankirtan Yagya. And we hear Srimad Bhagavatam to understand that this chanting Hare Krishna is meant to go on eternally. It's not. Sometimes people say, well, what happens when you become perfect? They may think you chant Hare Krishna and then all of a sudden, boop, you merge into some light. Well, it's not like that. The result of chanting Hare Krishna, what is it? More chanting Hare Krishna. And we go on. These activities are eternal. The activities of Krishna consciousness take us immediately to the eternal platform. It's not that we do some yoga and meditation in this life and then we merge into some light and that all the meditation is over. It's not just a means to an end. The means and the end are the same. So in this way, devotees who engage in Krishna's loving service, they are already liberated because they're acting on the liberated platform. We may not be fully free from all material attraction and material illusion, but because we're acting on the liberated platform, then we can be said to be liberated. Just like an iron in a hot fire, we know it's going to get hot. It's going to get as hot as the fire and will act just like fire if you touch it to someone's body. Just like in the South Indian Sampradayas, they put the hot stamp in the fire and then touch it to the body or press it on the body, and it makes an impression. So we know that it's just a matter, if it stays in the fire, it's going to get hot. And as soon as you start putting it in the fire, it starts to get hot. So in this way, a devotee acts on the liberated platform, even from the very beginning of Krishna consciousness practice. And even though he may not be fully liberated, we know that you just stay and will be fully liberated. In this, the whole trick is to be always absorbed in thoughts of Krishna. It takes some practice, but if we remain on the path, then success is certain. Whereas on the impersonal path, it's a very difficult path. It takes a very long time, and the result is not very certain. And even if you get the result, it's not very desirable. And even if you get the result of merging in some oneness, then you're prone to fall down from that position anyway. So overall, as Srimad Bhagavatam establishes over and over again, Bhakti Yoga, or Krishna consciousness, is really what we should be doing. It's the best thing for everyone. It's not that, well, for one person it's better to do Karma Yoga, for someone else it's better to do Jnana Yoga, for someone else it's better to do Hatha Yoga. No, for everyone, in whatever position they may be, it's best to do Bhakti Yoga and immediately connect with Krishna. Immediately come to the highest position, even without going through many lifetimes of different yoga practices. Hare Krishna. Any question about this, please?
Thank you, Maharaj, for the lecture. One question about deep sleep. It seems that in the deep sleep we just attaining some like voidness.
In deep sleep we attain voidness. Well, that's stated in Vedanta.
It seems.
It's stated like that in Vedanta Sutras, actually. Did you know that? That in the state of Sushupti is the technical name. It's like merging into Brahman. So, it's like merging into Brahman is something like going into deep sleep. Anesthesia. Yeah, it's something like that. But that the acharyas also, the commentators on Vedanta Sutras, they also state that it's not completely devoid of consciousness even in that deep state, deep sleep. And the example they give, or the evidence they give, is that when someone wakes up, they said, oh, I slept very nicely, very deeply. That's the example given. So some kind of consciousness must be there still.
Thank you.
Anything else? Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha. Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Dante nidhaya churnakang padayo nipatyakritva chakkakushatam etat aham ravimi. Hey sadhava sakala eva vihaya durat. Gauranga chandra charne kurutanuraga. Parivadatu jano yatata tava nanumukaro navayang vicharayama. Hari rasa madhirama dati mata bhuvi viluta. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.